Old Yeller, Chapter 3. All right, I was willing to go make a try for a fat doe. I was generally more than willing to go hunting, and while I was gone, I might do some thinking about little Arliss and that thieving stray dog. But I didn't much think my thinking would take the turn Mama wanted. I went and milked the cows and brought the milk in for Mama to strain. I got my rifle and went out to the lot and caught Jumper. I tied a rope around his neck, half hitched a noose around his nose, and pitched the rest of the rope across his back. This was the rope I'd rein him in with. Then I got me a second rope and tied it tight around his middle, just back of his withers. This second rope I'd use to tie my deer onto Jumper's back, if I got one. Papa had shown me how to tie a deer's feet together and pack it home across my shoulder, and I'd done it. But to carry a deer very far like that was a sweat-popping job that I'd rather leave to Jumper. He was bigger and stronger. I mounted Jumper bareback and rode him along Birdsong Creek and across the rocky Hogback Ridge. I thought how fine it would be if I was riding my own horse instead of an old mule. I rode down a long, sweeping slope where a scattering of huge, ragged-topped live oaks stood in grass so tall that it dragged against the underside of Jumper's belly. I rode to within a quarter-mile of the salt licks, then left Jumper tied to a thicket and went on afoot. I couldn't take Jumper close to the licks for a couple of reasons. In the first place, he'd get to swishing his tail and stomping his feet at flies and maybe scare off my game. On top of that, he was gun-shy. Fire a gun close to Jumper and he'd fall to staves. He'd snort and wheel to run and fall back against the tie rope trying to break loose. He'd bawl and paw the air and take on like he'd been shot. When it came to gunfire, Jumper didn't have any more sense than a red ant in a hot skillet. It was a fine morning for hunting, with the air still and the rising sun shining bright on the tall green grass and the greener leaves of the timber. There wasn't enough breeze blowing for me to tell the wind direction, so I licked one finger and held it up. Sure enough, the side next to me cooled first. That meant what little push there was to the air was away from me toward the salt licks, which wouldn't do at all. No deer would come to the licks if he caught wind of me first. I half-circled the licks till I had the breeze moving across them toward me and took cover under a wild grapevine that hung low out of the top of a gnarled oak. I sat down with my back against the trunk of the tree. I sat with my legs crossed and my rifle cradled on my knees. Then I made myself get as still as the tree. Papa had taught me that, way back when I was little, the same as he taught me that to hunt downwind for my game. He always said, "It's not your shape that catches a deer's eye, it's your moving. If a deer can't smell you and can't see you move, he won't ever know you're there." So I sat there, holding as still as a stump, searching the clearing around the licks. The licks was a scattered outcropping of dark rocks with black streaks in them. The black streaks held the salt that Papa said had got mixed up with the rocks a jillion years ago. I don't know how he knew what had happened so far back, but the salt was there, and all the hogs and cattle and wild animals in that part of the country came there to lick it. One time, Papa said, when he and Mama had first settled there, they'd run clean out of salt and had to beat up pieces of the rocks and boil them in water. Then they'd use the salty water to season their meat and cornbread. Wild game generally came to lick the rocks in the early mornings or late evenings, and those were the best times to come for meat. The killer animals, like bear and panther and bobcats, knew this and came to the licks at the same time. Sometimes we'd get a shot at them. I'd killed 2 bobcats and a wolf there while waiting for deer, and once Papa had shot a big panther right after it had leaped on a mule colt and broken its neck with one slap of its heavy forepaw. I hoped I'd get a shot at a bear or panther this morning. The only thing that showed up, however, was a little band of javelina hogs, and I knew better than to shoot them. Make a bad shot and wound one so that he went to squealing, and you had the whole bunch after you, ready to eat you alive. They were small animals. Their tushes weren't as long as those of the range hogs we had running wild in the woods. They couldn't cut you as deep, but once javelinas got after you, they'd keep after you for a lot longer time. Once, Jed Simpson's boy Rosal had shot into a bunch of javelinas and they took after him. They treed him up a mesquite and kept him there from early morning till long after supper time. The mesquite was a small one, and they nearly chewed the trunk of it in two trying to get to him. After that, Rosal was willing to let the javelinas alone. The javelinas moved away, and I saw some bobwhite quail feed into the opening around the licks. Then here came 3 cows with young calves and a roan bull. They stood and looked at the rocks. I watched them a while, then I got to watching a couple of squirrels playing in the top of a tree close to the one that I sat under. The squirrels were running and jumping and chattering and flashing their tails in the sunlight. One would run along a tree branch, then take a flying leap to the next branch. There it would sit, fussing, and wait to see if the second one had the nerve to jump that far. When the second squirrel did, the first one would set up an excited chatter and make a run for a longer leap. Sure enough, after a while, the leader tried to jump a gap that was too wide. He missed his branch, clawed at some leaves, and came tumbling to the ground. The second squirrel went to dancing up and down on his branch then, chattering louder than ever. It was plain that he was getting a big laugh out of how that show-off squirrel had made such a fool of himself. The sight was so funny that I laughed, myself, and that's where I made my mistake. Where the doe had come from and how she ever got so close without my seeing her, I don't know. It was like she'd suddenly lit down out of the air like a buzzard, or risen right up out of the bare ground around the rocks. Anyhow, there she stood, staring straight at me, sniffling and snorting and stomping her forefeet against the ground. She couldn't have scented me, and I hadn't moved, but I had laughed out loud a little at those squirrels, and that sound had warned her. Well, I couldn't lift my gun then with her staring straight at me. She'd see the motion and take a scare, and while Papa was a good enough shot to down a running deer, I'd never tried it and didn't much think I could. I figured it's smarter to wait. Maybe she'd quit staring at me after a while and give me a chance to lift my gun. But I waited and still she kept looking at me trying to figure me out. Finally, she started coming toward me. She'd take one dancing step and then another and bob her head and flap her long ears about and then start moving toward me again. I didn't know what to do. It made me nervous, the way she kept coming at me. Sooner or later she was bound to make out what I was. Then she'd whirl and be gone before I could draw a bead on her. She kept doing me that way till finally my heart was flopping around inside my chest like a catfish in a wet sack. I could feel my muscles tightening up all over. I knew then that I couldn't wait any longer. It was either shoot or bust wide open, so I whipped my gun up to my shoulder. Like I'd figured, she snorted and wheeled, so fast that she was just a brown blur against my gun sights. I pressed the trigger, hoping my aim was good. After I fired, the black powder charge in my gun threw up such a thick fog of blue smoke that I couldn't see through it. I reloaded, then leaped to my feet and went running through the smoke. What I saw when I came into the clear again made my heart drop down into my shoes. There went the frightened, snorting cattle, stampeding through the trees with their tails in the air like it was heel fly time. And right beside them went my doe, running all humped up and her white pointed tail clamped to her rump. Which meant that I'd hit her, but hadn't made a killing shot. I didn't like that. I never minded killing for meat. Like Papa had told me, every creature has to kill to live. But to wound an animal was something else, especially one as pretty and as harmless as a deer. It made me sick to think of the doe's escaping, maybe to hurt for days before she finally died. I swung my gun up, hoping yet to get in a killing shot, but I couldn't fire on account of the cattle. They were too close to the deer. I might kill one of them. Then suddenly the doe did a surprising thing. Way down in the flat there, nearly out of sight, she ran head on into the trunk of a tree, like she was stone blind. I saw the flash of her light-colored belly as she went down. I waited. She didn't get up. I tore out, running through the chin-tall grass as fast as I could. When I finally reached the place, all out of breath, I found her lying dead, with a bullet hole through her middle, right where it had to have shattered her heart. Suddenly, I wasn't sick anymore. I felt big and strong and sure of myself. I hadn't made a bad shot. I hadn't caused an animal a lot of suffering. All I'd done was get meat for the family, shooting it on the run, just like Papa did. I rode toward the cabin, sitting behind the gutted doe that I'd tied across Jumper's back. I rode, feeling proud of myself as a hunter and a provider for the family. Making a killing shot like that on a moving deer made me feel bigger and more important. Too big and important, I guess, to fuss with little Arliss about that old yeller dog. I still didn't think much of the idea of keeping him, but I guessed that when you are nearly a man you have to learn to put up with a lot of aggravation from little old bitty kids. Let Arliss keep the thieving rascal. I guessed I could provide enough meat for him too. That's how I was feeling when I crossed Birdsong Creek and rode up to the spring under the trees below the house. Then suddenly, I felt different. That's when I found little Arliss in the pool again, and in there with him was the big yeller dog, that dirty, stinking rascal romping around in our drinking water. "Arliss!" I yelled at little Arliss. "You get that nasty old dog out of the water!" They hadn't seen me ride up, and I guess it was my sudden yell that surprised them both so bad. Arliss went tearing out to the pool on one side and the dog on the other. Arliss was screaming his head off, and here came the big dog with his wet fur rising along the ridge of his backbone, baying me like I was a panther. I didn't give him a chance to get to me. I was too quick about jumping off the mule and grabbing up some rocks. I was lucky. The first rock I threw caught the big dog right between the eyes, and I was throwing hard. He went down, yelling and pitching and wallowing, and just as he came to his feet again, I caught him in the ribs with another one. That was too much for him. He turned tail then and took out for the house, squalling and bawling. But I wasn't the only good rock thrower in the family. Arliss was only 5 years old, but I'd spent a lot of time showing him how to throw a rock. Now I wished I hadn't, because about then a rock nearly tore my left ear off. I whirled around just barely in time to duck another that would have caught me square in the left eye. I yelled, "Arliss, you quit that!" But Arliss wasn't listening. He was too scared and too mad. He bent over to pick up a rock big enough to brain me with if he'd been strong enough to throw it. Well, when you're 14 years old, you can't afford to mix in a rock fight with your 5-year-old brother. You can't do it, even when you're in the right. You just can't explain a thing like that to your folks. All they'll do is point out how much bigger you are, how unfair it is to your little brother. All I could do was turn tail like the yeller dog and head for the house, yelling for Mama. And right after me came little Arliss, naked and running as fast as he could, doing his dead level best to get close enough to hit me with the big rock he was packing. I outran him, of course, and then here came Mama, running so fast that her long skirts were flying and calling out, "What on earth, boys?" I hollered, "You better catch that Arliss," as I ran past her, and she did. But little Arliss was so mad that I thought for a second he was going to hit her with the rock before she could get it away from him. Well, it all wound up about like I'd figured. Mama switched little Arliss for playing in our drinking water. Then she blessed me out good and proper for being so bossy with him. And the big yeller dog that caused all the trouble got off scot-free. It didn't seem right and fair to me. How could I be the man of the family if nobody paid any attention to what I thought or said? I went and led Jumper up to the house. I hung the doe in the live oak tree that grew beside the house and began skinning it and cutting up the meat. I thought of the fine shot I had made and knew it was worth bragging about to Mama. But what was the use? She wouldn't pay me any mind, not until I did something she thought I shouldn't have done. Then she'd treat me like I wasn't any older than little Arliss. I sulked and felt sorry for myself all the time I worked with the meat. The more I thought about it, the madder I got at the big yeller dog. I hung the fresh cuts of venison up in the dog run, right where old Yeller had stolen the hog meat the night he came. I did it for a couple of reasons. To begin with, that was the handiest and coolest place we had for hanging fresh meat. On top of that, I was looking for a good excuse to get rid of that dog. I figured if he'd stole more of our meat, Mama would have to see that he was too sorry and no account to keep. But old Yeller was too smart for that. He gnawed around on some of the deer's leg bones that Mama threw away, but not once did he even act like he could smell the meat we'd hung up.